World Whisky Review, brought to you by me, Man in the Sands. Come and join me. Hats off, game on. Welcome back. Whisky 101 welcomes you to another edition for those who are new to whisky and to understand what whisky is. Today, we are asking, what is Scotch? Firstly, we have to understand what whisky is. And I'm not talking about the mechanics and the distilling process. That will be discussed in later editions of Whisky 101. I'm talking about what is whisky. Some whisky is spelt with an E before the Y at the end. Other whisky has no E. Does it matter? No. Whisky is whisky is whisky. The Irish use an E. The Americans use an E. The Canadians do not use an E, and neither does Scotland. So, back to Scotland. What is Scotch? Before we understand what Scotch is, we have to consider what is a single malt. Now with that, hats off, game on. Slanger. That is a single malt right there. The colouring, beautiful single malt. In fact, it's one that I'm going to review later this week as part of the NAS range, the non-age statement. Now, back to single malt. Single malt whisky is whisky that is produced using barley only, water, yeast, distilled at the distillery site and bottled at site. Single malt does not mean it's come from one single barrel. It certainly will have been aged in wooden barrels, but it could have been sourced from multiple barrels of the same whisky producing that single malt. So if that is a single malt, what is a single grain? Well, it is similar, but grain has been added to the mash. We'll cover the mash in a later edition of the 101 series. But you have the barley, the yeast, the water, and a mash. Therefore, a blended whisky, which is for this purpose coming out of Scotland, that is a mix of single malt and single grain blended together, and they could have come from different distilleries. But can you have a single malt blend? Yes, you can. And my goodness, some of them are wonderful. And that simply means these are single malt whiskies that have been blended together. And blended really is where you're using whiskies from multiple sources and mixing them at certain proportionate levels to produce a certain tasting whiskey. One of my reviews recently was the Compass Box Lost Blend expression. Magnificent. And that is a wonderful example of a single malt blend. However, we want to know what Scotch is, and why is that different? Well, to be called Scotch, again, only barley, yeast and water may be used, with the exception of a colouring agent, the caramel. Caramel may be used for colouring, not for taste, because to be Scotch, it must taste and nose only of the produce itself and nothing added to it, other than the colouring agent of caramel. Also, it must not be less than 40% ABV, nor higher than 98.4% ABV. It must also be kept on site in the barrels for no less than 3 years. So that's 3 years aging minimum. 40 to 98.4% ABV, barley, yeast, water, produced and distilled only on site and bottled on site, and no greater than 700 litres of whiskey product itself. And that, my friends, allows it to be called Scotch. I hope you found this useful. You now understand that whiskey is whiskey is whiskey. But Scotch and single malt and single grain, blended and single malt blended of Scotland is not necessarily the same as whiskey with an E. Until the next time, look after yourselves, enjoy a wee dram or more, and I'll catch up with you another time. Slàinte.